Welcome to part 3 of my series Objects in the Rearview Mirror. Today I'm going to be talking about the most famous Chinese scroll. It's called the Qing Ming Festival. Now you probably think you've never heard of it, but chances are you have seen pictures from it and you know more about it than you think you do because you've probably been to a Chinese restaurant and seen some images on the wall. I went to Big Lots a few years ago and there was a wooden screen being sold, and all of the scenes on that screen came from this scroll. So let's get to it and talk about the Qing Ming Festival. Now you can see the most famous scene in the background here. It's the Rainbow Bridge and there's a crowd crossing it, there's boats going over it and all the rest. And I'll give you the pronunciation one more time and you can see there's the tone markers there to help you out. Qing Ming Festival. And a little bit later I will break down the Chinese and what it means. But for now, let's just carry on. Oh, I almost forgot. The images at the top and bottom of the screen at the moment are not just some border or banner. That's actually the entire scroll. It's impossible to display on a computer screen because it's about 7 meters long when you unroll it. So if you were to try and put it on the screen, well, I put it there twice, at the top and the bottom. But when I am showing you scenes from it, of course I have to zoom in, otherwise it would be unmanageable. Now, to give you some background of where it comes from. It comes from the Song Dynasty, and it's got a pretty easy Chinese character. I've given it to you there on the bottom left. And we believe that it was painted during the Northern Song. That's the first half of the Song Dynasty, from about 960 to 1127 AD. And at the time, its capital was Kaifeng. And I've circled it there for you on the map. And Kaifeng was the largest city in the world at the time. There were no cities in Europe even remotely close to it. There were some rivals perhaps in India, but Kaifeng was 1 million plus. It was about the size of Imperial Rome at its height and was a magnificent capital city. As I said, at this time period, there were no rivals anywhere in the world. Now, we believe that the scroll was painted during the reign of Emperor Huizong of the Song Dynasty. And we believe that the artist was called Zhang Zeduan. Now, again, for those unfamiliar with Chinese pronunciation, when you see a ZH, think of it like a J. Anytime you see a Chinese name with a ZH, think of it like a J. So I'll say his name one more time. Zhang Zeduan. And we think his dates were about 1085 to 1145 AD. Now do pay attention when I keep emphasizing we think this. It might have been then, because I'm going to explain a little bit later why all of this is, well, I wouldn't say guesswork, but it's uncertain. None of it can be stated as a certain fact. The reason for this is the artist did not put his name on the scroll. That the scroll is not dated. In fact, the title that I've given the scroll is also not on the scroll. So the attribution and the dating all come from a single piece of evidence, which was written during the Southern Song Dynasty period. And I will read to you now the sum total of the evidence we have for, well, when it was painted and who painted it. It was a note that was stuck onto the scroll about roughly 65 years later. And this is it. Hanlin academician Zhang Zeduan, courtesy name Zhang Dao, was a native of Dongwu. When young, he studied and travelled to the capital to further his learning. In this context, we're pretty sure the capital means Kaifeng. Later, he practiced painting. He was particularly skilled at ruled line painting and especially delighted in depicting boats, carts, markets, bridges, and streets. He developed his own distinctive style. According to Mr. Shang's views on paintings, both the Dragon Boat Regatta on the West Lake and the Qing Ming Festival are works of divine class. Collectors should treasure them. And this note is signed. It was written by Zhang Zhu of Yanchang on the day after the Qing Ming Festival in the Bingwu year of the Ding era, which we know in our Western calendar to be 1186 AD. Okay, sounds fairly good, I guess. The problem is, this is all we've got. And I've created this image here to give you the idea. First, Zhang Zhu, who is represented in this picture by that misty figure in the background, 65 years removed from the events. Who was Zhang Zhu? We don't know anything about him. He is otherwise unknown. The only place in Chinese history where his name appears is this note attached to the Qing Ming Festival. We know where he lived, which was, well, I'll get to that in a moment. He gives us his name, and that's it. So we don't know who he is. And then he cites a book, probably a book, written by somebody who I've translated as Mr. Shang. The reason why I translated it like that is we only know his surname. We don't know his personal name because Zhang Zhu didn't give it to us. We don't know who he was other than in this note. He is also not known in any other source. That book does not survive. We don't have anything else written by him. We don't know anything about this Mr. Shang. And then Zhang Zeduan also is known only from this note. We don't know if he painted anything else. It seems to imply he did. We don't know anything other than what was put on the note. So we've got an artist represented in this picture who we don't know much about. We have somebody called Mr. Shang who mentioned him in a book, which we don't know much about. And we have this fellow who wrote the note, Zhang Zhu, who we also don't know much about. So this is why I say you've got to be careful. There are a lot of things you'll find on the internet and elsewhere that will state categorically that Zhang Zeduan was the artist who painted the scroll. I hope I've made it clear to you that that is not a certain fact. Now, I want to give you a modern analogy to really bring it home just how uncertain it is. Now imagine we had a painting as I've put on the screen now. It's some antebellum southern city, could be South Carolina, could be Mississippi, could be anywhere really. Now, I've made the dates match more or less. So we have this painting that might be of antebellum Atlanta. It's been suggested that it could be Atlanta, but we're not sure. But everything in the image is pretty generic. There's nothing which is a clear landmark from the state of Georgia or the city of Atlanta. Could be anywhere, really. But we do know that the city was burned and probably looted by General Sherman in 1864, so that could be a time when the painting was looted. Now, in this analogy, you imagine that quite some time later, in 1929, 65 years after the burning of Atlanta, someone I've called Tom Smith, who we don't know anything about, attached a note to the painting. And on this note, Tom Smith said he lived near Washington, D.C., and he said that another guy with the same last name, John Smith, who we also don't know, painted this picture. And that Mr. Brown, who we also don't know, wrote in a book, which we don't know, that there were two paintings, this one and another one, that were really good. But we also don't know the other painting. And then in 2026, an archivist at the Smithsonian finds the painting and the note in storage, and it becomes famous, and everyone all over the internet asserts as a fact that it is a painting of Atlanta by John Smith. Well, that's clearly not a certain fact. It's possible that Zhang Zeduan painted the scroll. It's possible that Zhang Zhu knew what he was talking about, but this is the true level of uncertainty about where it comes from. Now, I have to give you a little bit of Song Dynasty history here so you understand what's going on. So I've already mentioned that we think it was painted during the Northern Song. And it's probably pretty obvious that the second half of the Song Dynasty was called the Southern Song, and I need to explain why we divide the dynasty into two halves like this. During the Northern Song, they never managed to take back all of the land that had once been ruled by past great dynasties like the Han Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty. And this was always quite a bother for them. To the north of them, there was a non-Chinese dynasty, which history books record as the Liao Dynasty. They were ethnically Khitan, so you'll often hear them called the Khitan Liao Dynasty. The name Khitan is not very well known, but in fact you may have heard it in one of its other forms, because the name Cathay, there's banks, the Cathay Bank, which largely caters to Asian people, and Cathay Pacific is the airline of Hong Kong. So it's one of those sort of oldie world sounding names for China, but actually it's derived not from the name of the Chinese people, but from the name of the Khitans. Now, the Khitans were quite sophisticated. They had once been horse-riding nomads, but they had, in fact, conquered this territory and settled down to live in the cities, and in fact had made a entirely different writing system. The Khitan writing system, which we still have not fully translated, is really rather unusual. I remember the first time after studying Chinese that I saw some Khitan writing, and I looked and said, oh, it's Chinese. Until I started looking at every character and realized I didn't know any of the characters. Not even one was a standard Chinese character. And in fact, the reason is because none of them are Chinese characters at all. They were clearly inspired by the idea of Chinese characters and adapted the idea to write down their own language, but it is an entirely different writing system. So contrary to the normal idea we have that, barbarians invade China and always just get assimilated by the Chinese and, start speaking Chinese and writing Chinese, this is not true of the Khitans. The Khitans were quite independent and quite different from the Chinese and highly successful and sophisticated. Now, the Song Dynasty really wanted to conquer them and take back the lands that had once been ruled by previous dynasties. You might compare it to the way that modern China always seems to want to get back Taiwan, because it was once ruled by past dynasties, so they see it as kind of a historic mission that they're supposed to get it back. Now, these kind of longings don't always work out very well for China. Now, in this case, they thought, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the Khitans were once horse-riding nomads, but they had kind of settled down and become quite civilized and literate and urban dwelling. And in China, they had expressions, the raw barbarians and the cooked barbarians. The cooked barbarians were the ones who had, done all those things that I just talked about with the Khitans. They'd settled down and become more civilized. Raw barbarians, on the other hand, were still tough and wild and, like their original form, unsullied by civilization, tending to be better and more dangerous soldiers. So the Song Dynasty decided to make a deal with the Jurchens, The Chinese call them the Nujin, and I've given you the Chinese characters as well, but in English we call them the Jurchens. And the deal was the Jurchens would attack from the north, and the Song would attack from the south, and, well, they would eliminate them. This plan kind of worked. The Song dynasty attacked from the south and honestly didn't get very far. The Jurchens attacked from the north and did spectacularly well and entirely conquered the Khitan with their Liao dynasty. The problem was the Jurchens didn't stop there. The Jurchens thought, well, that was easy, and they kept going south. And that great and glorious capital city of the northern Song dynasty, Kaifeng, was sacked and looted by the Jurchens in 1127. In fact, it was much worse than that. The emperor was taken prisoner. In fact, his father was still alive. He had abdicated in favor of his son. He was taken prisoner as well. About 3,000 senior court officials were taken prisoner, and the city was looted extensively of its treasures, and vast amounts of goods were taken north. The history books record it as the Jingkang incident, which really makes it sound like a fairly minor event. No, it wasn't. It was a cataclysm. Absolute disaster for the Song. So the Song lost all of the north. So the northern Song is over, and the southern Song continues. It's in, well, the south of modern China. And that lasts a fairly long time, 1127 to 1279, and their capital is relocated to modern Hangzhou. But in the Song dynasty, it was called Lin'an. The reason why they ended in 1279 was they really didn't learn the lessons of history, because they had fought numerous wars against the Jurchens, who had founded a new dynasty. They called it the Qin dynasty. You can see it on the map. And the Song kept attacking them and getting nowhere. And the Jurchens, in turn, attacked the Song and didn't get very far either. The north of China is like a great plain, very suitable for cavalry warfare. Once you get down into that more ready zone on the map, it gets a lot more wet, it gets a lot more jungle and forest, and much more effective for infantry armies like the Chinese were able to field. So it was largely a stalemate. So the Song dynasty, the southern Song, decided, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And there was another group of uncooked barbarians further to the north of the Jurchens. We now call them the Mongols. And so they made a deal. How about the Mongols attack from the north and the Song will attack from the south, and hey, we can crush the Jurchens between us. The plan worked splendidly. The Mongols did indeed conquer the Qin dynasty and took over the entire north. And then, after a few years, decided, well, why not just take the whole darn lot, and in turn conquered the Song dynasty and founded the Mongol Yuan dynasty with Kublai Khan and other figures you may have heard of. The Qin dynasty, Jurchen capital, was at a place called Zhongdu, which really just means central capital, which I've labeled on the map. You might be more familiar with it under the name of Beijing. People sometimes call it Peking as well, the modern-day Chinese capital. That was, in fact, the first time that Beijing had been used as a national capital. It had been used as a regional capital at other periods in Chinese history, but under the non-Chinese Jurchens, it was the first time that Beijing had ever actually been a full capital city. Now, you might compare this cataclysm to what happened to the Romans. When we talk about the fall of Rome, we usually mean the fall of the Latin-speaking West, because the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire carried on strong for another 1,000 years. But they lost their original homeland. They lost Italy, they lost Sicily, they lost all of that area where the Roman Empire had first started. Well, the same is true for the Chinese. That northern area that was ruled by the Jurchens, that was the original homeland of Chinese civilization. That was the Yellow River, that was the Great Plain. That's where all of the great dynasties had been founded and had ruled from. This was the first time that they had entirely lost them. Well, actually, it wasn't the first. When the Han Dynasty collapsed, there was a whole bunch of barbarians who came down as well. But it was basically, as I said, the equivalent of the Romans hung on in an area that had not been part of their original homeland, but they lost all of the west. Well, in the case of the Chinese, they lost all of the north, but hung on in the south, which had not been part of their original homeland. Now, Linan, Hangzhou, was also a glorious city, and it grew to about 1.5 million. In fact, it was probably the biggest city the world had ever known in any epoch. It had a great lake called the West Lake, and, well, there's lots of art and poetry and literature and things that came out of the great Chinese capital of Linan. Perhaps the second most well-known of the great southern Song cities was Suzhou, which is sometimes called Venice of the East. It had canals and things like this, and it's very pretty. In fact, a lot of tourists, when they go to China, they visit Shanghai, and then they do day trips to go and see Hangzhou and Suzhou. And in fact, there's a little saying in Chinese, which is Shang you Tiantang, Xia you Suhang, which the translation I've given you on the screen, above is heaven, below is Suzhou and Hangzhou. In other words, it's the closest you can get to heaven on earth. And another funny little thing I learned a few years ago was in China, they considered the local accent of the people who was from Suzhou to be the most feminine accent of all. I learned this because I knew a girl from Suzhou that I met in Australia, and she absolutely hated how everybody thought her accent was so feminine, so she did her best to speak really rough and harsh, so nobody would think she was from Suzhou. Now, they're stuck in the south. They're still dreaming of recapturing the north. And we have a poem that kind of expresses some of that feeling. But this poem was more like graffiti. You wrote it on a wall and you did it a little bit anonymously because it was the kind of thing where you were criticizing or making a point. And as with a lot of Chinese poems, you'll realize at the beginning it just sounds a little bit meh. There's nothing much to it. The twist of the knife that suddenly gives it meaning comes in the final line. And, well, here it is. Green hills upon green hills, towers beyond towers. Will the singing and dancing on Westlake ever cease? The warm breeze intoxicates the pleasure seekers. They treat Hangzhou exactly as if it were Kaifeng. Now, what does this mean? It's a sharp criticism because all these officials are relaxing, partying, drinking, having a great time in the south. And Lin Shang is saying, have you forgotten we're not in Kaifeng? We lost Kaifeng. Why are you relaxing and partying and looking so happy? Have you forgotten that we need to recapture the north, that we need to recapture Kaifeng? This is not our capital city. This is our capital city in exile. Think of the Free French and, under de Gaulle in England. The Nazis had France. What are you relaxing and partying for? We have a mission to recapture our homeland. No, of course, the Song Dynasty was never going to actually accomplish that. Now, the reason why I had to give you all that background is so you can understand that Zhang Zeduan, who wrote that little note, lived in Zhongdu. He lived in the capital city of the Qing Dynasty. So, we have a number of theories about what happened with the scroll. I forgot to mention a very important fact here. The scroll was discovered in Beijing in 1953. Yes, I mean 1953 AD, modern times, after World War II, after the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Somebody was going through all the archives in the palace and found this wonderful scroll. It was about 1,000 years old, An absolutely amazing piece. But where was it? What's its backstory? Well, we don't know. What is the city in the scroll? Well, the most popular hypothesis is it's Kaifeng. It's the northern Song capital. And then maybe when the Jurchens looted Kaifeng and took a lot of treasures, we know that they took a lot of artwork and all sorts of things, they took it back to Zhongzhou, which was later called Beijing, and in fact it stayed there for 1,000 years and never left. But the city in the picture is Kaifeng. That's theory number one. Theory number two is that it's not actually a real city at all. It's an idealized city. Now, the theory there comes from the fact that there aren't any recognizable landmarks. It just seems to be a generic city on a river. It's there's nothing really to mark it out as any particular city. So it's possible that it's just some Song Dynasty city, probably from the Northern Song period, but unclear. The second possibility is that it's painted during the Southern Song Dynasty, and it's part of that sense of longing, of remembering. Painting Kaifeng, perhaps painted by somebody who was doing it from memory of being in Kaifeng decades ago, or possibly somebody who had never seen Kaifeng. And it's the nostalgia of the Southern Song, remembering their lost city of Kaifeng. The third one is a bit harder because it doesn't explain how the scroll ended up in Beijing, well, Zhongzhou, but it's still possible that it could just be Southern Song nostalgia for their lost territories of the North. Now next, as I promised, I'm going to explain the Chinese title of the scroll. Now there's the Chinese character Qing Ming Tu. Now the third, fourth, and fifth characters are not very problematic. It means something along the lines of on the river picture. Tu means picture. Shang is next to the river, along the river, on the river, something along those lines. So we don't really have much problem with the last three characters. The problem is with the first two characters, Qing Ming. Now, if we just translate them literally, it means something like clear and bright. For example, when you're speaking Chinese and you want to say, "Oh, do you understand me? Mingbai? Is it clear?" The same Ming. And Qingchu, yes, it's very clear. So a literal translation would be clear and bright on the river picture. Very literal there. One scholar has suggested perhaps it's supposed to be peaceful and orderly, like everything's good. It's a city with everything happening in a nice way, as it should, along the riverbank. That's a possibility. Now, the problem is there's a festival in China. They still celebrate it today, but they celebrated it in the Song Dynasty as well. And it's called the Qing Ming Festival, Qing Ming Jie. And it's the grave sweeping festival. In fact, the ancient Romans had something quite similar. It's a day of the year where you're supposed to go back to the graves of your ancestors and tidy them up, pull out all the weeds and clean them up and all the rest. So very often you will hear this scroll described as the Qing Ming Festival along the river. Now that is also unclear and problematic. Now the Qing Ming Festival is celebrated in early April, and that has stayed fairly consistent. So it's well into the spring where all the blossoms would be out and the leaves would be on the trees and people go to the graves and, clean them up and tidy them up and pray to their ancestors and all of that kind of good stuff. The problem is when we actually look at the scroll, the trees don't match. It's the wrong season. So I think it's unlikely that the scroll actually shows the Qing Ming Festival, and there's nothing in the scenes of the scroll that seem to be unique to the grave sweeping festival. And in fact, there's one thing that seems very problematic indeed. Quite early in the scroll, there's this scene I put in the blue circle. Now, normally, we would say this is probably just a normal procession carrying either a noble man or more likely a noble woman, in that, you can see there's two servants and they're carrying that sort of sedan chair along. But you can see, if you look carefully, that the sedan chair has a bunch of branches or something which are all sticking out of it. And the person immediately behind it seems to be carrying fish. Now, those two clues suggest that this is a wedding party. They've decorated the sedan chair, and the fish in this case, well, I don't know if you know any Chinese people, but at the Chinese New Year, it's a tradition that they always eat fish. The reason for that is the Chinese word for fish, yu, sounds very similar to, well, in fact, it sounds the same as the Chinese word for surplus. So, nian nian you yu means every year have fish, but it also means every year have a surplus. So, by eating fish, you're ensuring prosperity and a surplus for the coming year. But it's also sometimes used in Song Dynasty weddings because, wishing the married couple and their wedding day to have prosperity and a surplus in their life, to never be lacking anything. So it seems reasonably safe to assume that this is a wedding party, and that would be incredibly problematic. Nobody's going to get married on the grave sweeping festival, a festival day completely associated with the dead and with ancestors. It would be a ludicrously bad day to get married in China. So I think it just looks like the wrong season. And if this is indeed a wedding party, these are two pieces of evidence that strongly suggest that this is not the Qing Ming Festival, and that we should go with that earlier translation, clear and bright, or maybe peaceful and orderly along the river. But just as you will find all over the internet, people confidently stating that this was painted by the Song Dynasty artist Zhang Zeduan, well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, they will also confidently state that it's the Qing Ming Festival along the river. Well, maybe it is, but probably it isn't. Now, moving along. There's a picture from modern-day China. It's not like everybody in China gets married like this, but it's also still a custom practiced. And when I found that picture, I thought it was rather delightful, because it really aligns quite nicely with this picture we see from 1,000 years prior during the Song Dynasty. That particular picture actually comes from the far north of China, Heilongjiang. And it's an area where the Jurchens actually originated. So that's an interesting little side note. Now, for most of the rest of this episode, I'm just going to be talking you through the scroll. Now, when we read English, we read left to right. But traditional Chinese is written from right to left. And it's normally assumed that this is how the scroll would have been viewed. In fact, it wouldn't have been unrolled all at once. As I said, it's about 7 meters long. What's that? Something in the order of almost 10 yards long. You'd need a very large table or something to lay it all out. So the assumption is when somebody was viewing it, they would open the scroll from the right and look at a bit of the scene, and then they would gradually work their way along. So we're going to do the same thing for the rest of the episode, and I'm going to draw out certain scenes. And it's kind of like a Chinese Where's Waldo. There's so many people, so many things going on. Every time I study this picture, I find something new. So I'm going to share some of the things. It would take far too long to share them all. So we start at the extreme right of the scroll, and you can see we're well outside the city. It's a countryside scene. There's a little stream. There's a guy there who's leading a bunch of pack animals, probably donkeys, I'd guess, presumably bringing trade goods, maybe food or something like that, into the city. He's sort of got a fair amount of cargo there. and he's on his way into the city. And then we move along in the scroll, and we're still well out in the countryside. We can see some houses that are presumably houses of farmers, and you can get a pretty good idea that they seem to have pretty good houses. You can see some of the houses are thatch. You can see one in the background looks like it's got tiles on it. And there's this interesting little device over here on the left. And we actually have samples of these from ancient China. They're basically like threshing stones. You'd get a very, very solid base and put the grain under it and roll it over, or you could use it for flattening out fields. And sometimes we see them with the wooden frame. Sometimes the wooden frame could be removed. It'd be pretty darn heavy, but a pretty useful device. So it's quite interesting because it gives us a bit of an insight into some of the agricultural technology that was being used in China 1,000 years ago. And then also early in the scroll, we have this interesting party. Now, they're really quite unusual. The normal assumption is they're just two old ladies who are riding, and they're being escorted by some men, but they're very unique. It could just be traveling clothes with these big headgear, but we don't really see anybody else who looks like that. And this woman on the right, she has very prominent features. You can see she's got quite a projecting jaw, a fairly, substantial nose and things like this. And every time I look at her, I think she doesn't look terribly Chinese. Okay, maybe she's supposed to be an old Chinese lady, but I wonder if she is supposed to be some other person. Like we know, for example, there were Sogdians. These were people who lived on the Silk Road, and we know that they would come on trading missions into China. So every time I look at these characters, I wonder, who are they? Which is one of the problems we have with the scroll. We have an enormous amount of information. It teaches us a lot about what was going on, but we don't have anything to describe what it is. It's all up to our own eyes to interpret what we're seeing. Now there they are down the bottom, we were just talking about, and you can see again lots of these trees, which, it doesn't look like it's the full flourishing of spring. You can see the wedding party at the top there. But there's a few other interesting things going on here. We can see our first evidence of a child, for example. I'm pretty sure that's a child, and it looks like there's a parent running out, hey, come back. And then there's this rather interesting thing. Is it a signpost? But it looks almost like it's got a dragon head. Now, in China, they have these great ceremonial things. Call them a Chinese totem pole. Now, normally these are associated with imperial palaces and also what they called the spirit pathway on tombs of emperors. So according to our normal understanding, it would be very unusual to find something like that out on the countryside next to a peasant's house. But I don't know what else it's supposed to be. It's a really rather unusual looking thing, and it looks to me like it might just be a peasant equivalent version of a Chinese totem pole, but who knows? Now, in front of the wedding party, there's something funny going on. There seems to be a figure, and he seems to be running, and then these two people seem to be pursuing him. They're certainly pointing at him, saying, hey, come back. So is he supposed to have stolen something, or has he done something disrespectful? Again, we don't know. All we can do is use our eyes, and the problem is the past is a foreign country. This is not my saying, but it's very true. Even a Chinese person is not looking at contemporary China. They can't use contemporary Chinese customs and assume that everything that happened in the Song Dynasty happened according to the same rules. Think of your own country. It's a very different place 100 years ago. In the United States, America at the time of World War I is a very different country from America of 2026. And America at the time of the Revolution is a very different place from the America of World War I. So it's hard to judge what's going on. I'm not Chinese, but I've studied China a lot, and I've studied Chinese language, I've read a lot of Chinese history. I teach Chinese history at university, but trying to interpret what's going on, well, we can just do our best. Now, the next scene, you can see over on the right, there's that thing I speculated might be something like a Chinese totem pole, and we have a few typical countryside scenes. We have some water buffalo, we've got probably another one of those stone things without the wooden frame attached. And then we have these fellows. It seems to be some kind of tavern or restaurant, and they seem to have their worldly goods on a pole that would go over their back. In fact, Roman legionaries would actually be quite similar in this respect. When we see how Roman legionaries would carry their gear, they would have their spears, their pila, their pilum, and they would hang their changes of clothes or their food off their spears, which would go over their shoulders. So this is something which we could see in the ancient Roman Empire, and this seems to be how somebody who didn't have their own wagon or horse would carry their worldly goods on a pole over their shoulder. Then hidden behind a tree, partly obscured, we can see a boat, a riverboat, and we can see there's a gangplank going up on shore, and there's a couple of guys who seem to be carrying, goods or something on shore. And there's another boat. In fact, there are quite a lot of riverboats that can be found in this scroll, and they're really rather fascinating. We can get a lot of detail about how these things were built and how they had structures over the top for roofs, and you can see there's a person hidden away. In fact, we often see figures that look kind of female. So these are probably homes as much as commercial vessels. Now, one thing you may notice here is that the rudder is built into the stern of the boat. And this, in China, is old technology by the time we get to the Song Dynasty. We have this pottery version with a clear rudder built into the stern of the boat. And that comes from the Eastern Han Dynasty. That's about 800 years, 900 years prior to the Song Dynasty. The Chinese had been building these kind of things for centuries. And the one we see here, and other ones we see elsewhere in the scroll, is clearly highly sophisticated. We know that some of these were designed so that they could be lifted up and down, because when you're going through rivers, the depth of the river will change. So sometimes you need it deeper in the river, sometimes you need it higher. This thing is unknown in Europe. It will be maybe the 1180s before anybody in Europe will be making any kind of rudder that is built into the stern. Prior to this, it's always just been like a long stick or something that stick out the back, and you try and use it to steer along. Certainly the Romans and the Greeks didn't have anything like this, and it has been speculated, but without clear evidence, that this technology may have in fact been borrowed from China. So they were a long way ahead of Westerners in their boat building technology during the Song Dynasty. So you can see there on the left, there's the two boats I was talking about. There's the two gangplanks. And up here we have all the cargo that's being unloaded. Clearly they're taking the goods off the boat, and they seem to be arranging it all. And what's this guy doing? Making sure nobody steals it. Behind them we have this interesting scene. Don't really know what's going on there. Is it some old man, some old beggar? Is he carrying something like a lantern perhaps? And he's being helped by someone else? Possibly. Not really sure. And then up there we see one of those people I was talking about with the pole over their shoulder carrying their worldly goods. And I already mentioned those guys. And mentioned him as well. I was getting ahead of myself. Now, also early in the scroll, we have up in the background, we have some interesting scenes of things that are going on. Now you see there's some Chinese characters down there. Now, if you're paying attention, you'll notice that the sign that I inserted there is not the same as the sign that we're looking at right now in the scroll. That other sign comes from a much later stage in the scroll, but it's much bigger and clearer. It's really rather hard to read what is going on. In fact, I'm not really sure that the artist even intended us. They are Chinese characters, but, well, they're not large, they're not clear. But I've used another example from elsewhere in the scroll to help me interpret it. And this is what I'm pretty sure it says. It's long stay at the Wang family's extravagant household. It's an inn, in other words. Come stay here. I have seen other interpretations who are wildly different. In fact, I found one guy on the internet who was sure that sign said it was a shop selling paper models, and that the display there is paper models that have all been made. Well, who knows? I've given you my best interpretation. Now here, you have these bamboo frames around the door, and that's always a clear indication this is a place where you can go and buy booze. And the sign, even though it's fairly hard to read, I'm pretty confident it says Xiaojiu. Now, literally, that is small alcohol. But in the Song Dynasty context, that'll mean something like cheap booze. Not a high-end establishment where people coming off the road can stop and get a quick drink, just sort of a working man's watering hole, shall we say. And there's one other figure with one of those big headdresses. Is that another of those women similar to the ones we saw outside? I don't know. And then as we move along, up on the top right, that was those scenes where they had those two shops I was talking about. You can see there's a lot of boats all pulled up against the riverbank. And once again, we get a view of their amazing rudder systems. And you can see that on different boats, they are slightly different, but, well, clearly sharing a technological basis, but not, well, carbon copies. They're probably made by individual craftsmen. And I've highlighted again a couple of figures on there. The one on the top right and the one on the left, well, again, are they males, are they females? But clearly these things are houseboats, not just commercial vessels. And then we have some more of them along the riverbank, a little bit closer up. And you can see there's somebody in that circle who seems to be cooking something. You see they've got their little furnace there. I bet you'd want to be pretty careful with that, with fire aboard a boat, but pretty sure that's what's going on. A couple of guys there who've just got off the boat, I'm guessing, and somebody sitting on the roof here, somebody relaxing inside having a drink. And then as we move a bit further on, we've got a bunch more boats. And some really rather interesting things are going on this part of the scroll. First off, on the boats, you can see that they clearly are able to open up those wooden coverings to let some air in. So I guess when they're in high rain and things like this, and then they will close them up. But when they're there, they will open them up and let some air blow through. And again, you can see there's a person just poking out there through that little glimpse we have aboard the ship. Also, in a couple of places here, we see these pulley winch systems, which again gives us some interesting insight into the kind of technology that was available to them to, when the ships came to shore, how they winch them up and make sure they stay in place. And this guy, you can see, has a little running board going along the outside of his boat. So he's walking along, and there also seems to be some figure perhaps cooking lunch there just inside the window we're indicating. Now, this particular boat here has a really interesting mast. Now, when you first look at it, you will probably assume that it's a mast to put a sail on. This is a sailboat. But once you start looking at it, you realize it doesn't look right. There's no real way to hoist a sail. The angle and lines just don't look right. But I've already helped you out here with my red arrows on the screen, because the answer is found when you follow that rope. And I'll show you right now where that rope leads. The rope goes a long way up the riverbank, and we've got these 5 guys who are pulling hard on the rope. So now let's go backwards again. Now you can see what's going on. This is not a sail. This is basically a hoist system for pulling boats upriver. Now the current can't be all that strong, because if 5 guys are capable of pulling a large boat upriver with just this long rope there, well, I don't think they'd get very far if the river current was running very fast. So this whole structure here, it's not to hold a sail, it's to support working men on shore to pull them upstream against the current. Now, you won't need that if you're going downstream. You can just let the current take you. So it's really quite interesting because it tells us which way the river is flowing, which will be useful later for some other things that are going on in the scroll. There they are again. Now, up there in the top center, there's something very interesting. It's this interesting one-wheeled wagon, and it's being pulled by a couple of donkeys. Now, we know exactly what that is. That is the Chinese wheelbarrow. But of course, when we think of a wheelbarrow, we think of something quite different. But we have plenty of examples from, well, even the age of early photography, of Chinese using these really rather novel things. And I actually looked around and I managed to find one picture that showed, well, a man even using a donkey to help him pull it along. And we see several of these in different parts of the scroll. So somebody's coming in from the countryside. Looks like they've put some sort of blanket to protect their cargo, and they're probably bringing trade goods in to sell at market. Now, in the middle of the river, we have another boat that's hidden by a tree. And at both ends, they have these rather enormous things. Now, when I first looked at them, I thought, not every boat has a built-in rudder. But then, if it's supposed to be a rudder, like was used in more primitive boats, and, well, frankly, was used in a lot of boats in Europe for quite a long time, it would make no sense whatsoever to have them on both ends. And especially, you see the one on the right. There's 8 guys, and they seem to be straining quite hard in it. These are more like paddles. They're not rudders, and they seem to be using it to maneuver the boat along in the river. Like, is this another way of working your way upstream, or are they just trying to work across stream? I'm not quite sure where they're going, but this seems to be the case with 2 absolutely massive paddles. Now, here is probably the most famous scene of the whole scroll involving the bridge. And usually most people focus on the bridge. We'll get to that in a moment. But to me, I think the boat is actually the most interesting thing. And so does everybody else in the picture. All these people I've highlighted with the red arrows are just gawking. They're all looking, they're pointing, looks like they're shouting directions. It seems very true to life. It's a dramatic scene, and an awful lot of people are getting involved. And here we have an awful lot of action happening on the boat. Now we have this guy here who's got this stick, and he seems to be stretching it up. And there are these guys up there that have climbed outside the railings of the bridge who are there trying to grab the stick, presumably. And you've got actually about 5 men in total who are beyond the railings, who seem to be actively trying to help rather than just gawk and shout instructions. And then we have all of these guys, and they have these other long bamboo poles, and they seem to be using it to stick it into the river and push the boat and all the rest. Now again, I read one guy's description online that says these guys are panicking because the current is carrying them into the bridge, and they're desperately trying to stop it, and the mast hasn't been properly lowered, and it's a disaster in the making, blah, blah, blah. I absolutely think that's nonsense. Because we know that the river is flowing from left to right. That these guys are trying to move their boat up river, and they're trying to move their boat upriver under the bridge. And the normal mechanism for using guys to pull it doesn't work. So they've lowered the mast, and they're trying to work their way upriver under the bridge, which was, well, it is a difficult process. And then we also have these guys who do seem to be looking like they're getting rather anxious and pointing. And I think it's because of this thing down here, which I'm indicating with the mouse. Remember the oars, the paddles that those guys on the other boat were using? There's another boat that's making its way under the bridge. It's less clear if it's going downriver or upriver, but there's definitely a danger of collision. These guys are not panicking because they're worried about hitting the bridge. They're trying to head towards the bridge. I think they're rather anxious, however, because there's another boat that's under the bridge at the same time as them. Now, let's spend a bit more time and talk about the bridge itself. Oh, well, first off, you can see there's the other half of the boat that's running under the bridge there, which they've got to avoid as they're going. Now, this bridge, often called a rainbow bridge, is a marvel of technology. You might notice there are no supports. It's wood, it's arched. A number of people have actually done, those modern scientific studies where you try to work out, how did people build the pyramids by seeing if you can move the great stones yourself. Well, people have tried to build bridges like this using self-supporting wood. You can see enough of what's going on to get an idea of exactly how it would work. And the answer is yes, it does work. And there's a lot of weight on that bridge. Look at all those people up there. There's, I don't know, what's that? Dozens of people. I haven't actually tried to count them all. So it's a strong bridge, and it's necessary to have something like this with a high arch so these boats can get under it. It's really the engineering level of skill and mastery that not seen anywhere else in the world at this point. And on the bridge, we see some things. The top blue circle is probably somebody selling dumplings, selling some good Chinese food. And the bottom blue circle looks a lot like somebody selling metalware, possibly knives and other metal tools. And then we have lots of things going on. We have another one of those sedan chairs that's being carried by servants. My assumption when I see them is usually that it's a noble woman. We have what's clearly a more upper-class man who's riding a horse. That's not a donkey. And he seems to have some servants with him saying, "Clear the way, get out of the way for my master." So there's donkeys carrying cargo. There's a lot going on. And of course, here's all the gawkers and the helpers trying to, watching that boat trying to get under the bridge. Now, the thing about those metal knives and goods being sold is that one of the things that most people in modern times don't appreciate is how valuable and expensive metal is. Metal has to be mined. It's dangerous. It's difficult. And when you don't have modern explosives, you don't have modern drills or trucks or bulldozers, it's difficult and expensive. If you could bring somebody from ancient times in a time machine to the present day, they wouldn't be able to comprehend most things. They wouldn't know what a computer was. It would just be a magic box. They wouldn't know what a TV was. So many things they wouldn't be able to comprehend. But one of the things that would truly amaze them would be the superabundance of metal everywhere. Just how much metal we have. And that would impress them. They go, "Wow, you are so rich to have so much metal. Look at this, you have a chair and you made the legs out of metal. What kind of show-off are you?" Just showing off how amazingly wealthy you are. That's something that they would understand, or perhaps not understand. And we do know that the Song Dynasty looked to be heading, in a way, towards an industrial revolution. Their iron production was way up. If we compare Song Dynasty iron production, it's estimated to have been something the order of 600% greater than the last great dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, that came before them. Now, this is something which we see in the scroll, and I want to teach you a little bit about Song Dynasty history. This was the first time China passed 100 million people. This makes Song Dynasty China more populous than the Roman Empire at its height, which had already mostly fallen by this stage. There was a massive increase in yield from particularly rice production. They had come up with some new methods for farming rice that really, increase the yields by quite a lot. And we're starting to see a bunch of other things that we associate with the beginnings of the modern world. As I already mentioned that, China's population passes 100 million for the first time. Mentioned that Kaifeng had a population of about 1 million, Linan, perhaps a 1.5 million. And Song China had perhaps 24 towns with populations over 100,000. Now again, this doesn't sound very impressive to us moderns, but I want to give you some perspective here. Venice and Paris, two very large and prosperous cities in Europe at this time period, had a population of 100,000. So, and they were two of the biggest cities in Europe at the time. I mean, London might compare, but they're really, you could count on one hand how many cities Europe had of 100,000. So in other words, Song Dynasty China had 24 towns the size of Venice and Paris, and the southern Song capital was 15 times bigger than Paris. I mean, this is just unimaginable. Now, Marco Polo visited after the fall of the Song, during the period of the Mongols, and there'd been a crash dive in the population that it was only just recovering when Marco Polo was there, but this was his observation. So frequent and continuous are the towns that you seem as you ride to go through the middle of a single city. It was something we normally associate with modern urban growth, where you have these agricultural towns that just grew bigger and bigger until they bleed into each other and become one giant city. Well, that kind of population growth and urban growth was something that Marco Polo observed when he was traveling through the land of the Manza, as he called it, the southern Chinese, as the Mongols called them at the time. And it really was a time of incredible technological change. Normally, when we're measuring industrial capacity, we think about iron and coal production. These are the things we certainly associate with the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Now, to give it a comparison, it was similar. The Song Dynasty had similar iron and coal production to where Europe was in 1700. Now, 1700 is before the Industrial Revolution, but it's close to the Industrial Revolution. It's the early 1800s. And in terms of the growth in yields, it was astonishing. In the 200 years, 1540 to 1740, English iron production increased by 400%. But in an equivalent 200-year period, Chinese iron production was up by 1,200%. This really does look like China spinning up towards an industrial revolution. And this picture over on the right is from a manual teaching people about industrial production and harvesting natural resources. They were quite aware, and this is what the picture shows, that when you were mining coal, that poisonous gases could be released. So you see it's teaching you about using bamboo poles to try to leach out the poison gases so that the miners in the ground, don't die, obviously. So they were, it wasn't just, go on the ground with a pickaxe and bang, bang, bang. They were developing clear methods, and, well, it was working. And as you get more and more metal, you get a positive feedback loop. More iron means more iron for plows, which means better agricultural productivity. More iron for weapons. In fact, during the Song Dynasty, we start to see another thing we associate with the modern world, standardized weapons for the army. Like you get, small helmet, medium helmet, big helmet, small breastplate, medium breastplate, large breastplate, all of these kind of things. This is one of the things, by the way, Hollywood almost always gets wrong about armies in the ancient world, except for the armies of Imperial Rome, the late Republic and the early Empire. No pre-modern army is going to look very standardized. It's going to be a hodgepodge of colors and equipment. There will be similarities, but they're not going to look all identical like they've all been issued their uniforms and weapons by the quartermaster. That's completely wrong. But during the Song Dynasty, that's one of the few times where it wouldn't be wrong. The soldiers really would be all wearing very similar armor and equipment. Is it a precursor for an industrial revolution? Well, obviously we know that China did not have an industrial revolution, but it sure looks like they could have. Now, carrying on. After we get off the bridge, we see another one, in fact, two of those wheelbarrow contraptions. And down the bottom, a lot of very true to life, interesting little figures. This guy at the bottom, I would say he's selling barbecued meats. He's probably cooked those kebab-like things over a fire, and there's a mother with a child. Now, there's not many females in the scroll. When you compare males to females, it's probably fewer than 10% of the figures are female, and we usually see them with an escort. And this is an unusual thing that we have a female figure who doesn't seem to have any male escorts with her, and she's in fact got a child with her. But, well, no, that's just to be noted. And then the second blue circle there, looks like this guy's stopped his wheelbarrow contraption, and is it some cloth or something? I would say they're bargaining away. Here, look at this fine cloth. It's the best cloth you could get. You should give me a good price. I'll give you a good price for it. Come on, let's make a deal. And then we have the most I'd say the second most elaborate of these bamboo contraptions. And I already told you, when you see these bamboo entrances with these elaborate patterns, it's always going to be somewhere where you buy booze. Now, we know that on the flag, it actually says, new wine, fresh wine, come get your booze. And that sign down the bottom there, Jiaodian, now literally it means foot shop. And in modern Chinese, it sounds like, what is this, like somewhere you get foot massages? But it's, in the Song Dynasty, it was something like a place to rest your feet. In other words, it's a place you can stay, accommodation. It's probably, again, the people have just crossed the bridge. They're heading in towards the town. They probably had a long journey. Well, we have rooms for rent. And there are signs, and it's two characters on either side of the door, but they seem to form a single phrase, Tianzhi Mei Lu, heaven's beautiful bounty. In fact, it's the name of the shop. Come here to get wonderful things that are so tasty. It's as if they're from heaven. Well, got to have some advertising. Now, out on the boat, out on the river, I should say, we've got two more of those boats. We have one with a built-in rudder, and you can see there's another team of 5 men who are helping pull this one upriver. And again, we have those two teams with those giant paddles who are also making their way up. It seems to be two different methods that they use for making their way upriver. And lots and lots of boats. You can see these guys have got a gangplank and they're going down on board. And down the bottom here we have, again, looks like another restaurant with open-air tables, all sorts of things going on. Now, we're finished now with the boats. But I wanted to make a comment here about Song Dynasty technology, particularly related to shipbuilding. Now, everything we're seeing in the scene are riverboats, but they're riverboats with rudders built into the structure. They're highly sophisticated. They're highly developed. They're light years ahead of everyone else. Now, people who talk about China get really uptight or worked up about the great treasure fleets during the Ming Dynasty, which is several hundred years in the future. And go, it's so amazing that the Chinese could send these treasure fleets all the way down into the Indian Ocean and even to the, off the coast of Africa. And, well, I'll be a bit blunt here. There's an idiot called Menzies who wrote a stupid book, which is just utter nonsense. Just trust me on this. I don't have time to go into it, but saying, the Chinese actually discovered America, blah, 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 blah. Seriously, there's some cauldrons that were used by early European whalers in New Zealand, and he uses that as evidence. Clearly Chinese cauldrons. No, they're not. It's trust me, it's nonsense. But on the other hand, people spend so much time focusing on these particular ships during the Ming Dynasty, they fail to realize that sailing to the Indian Ocean really was nothing very special for the Chinese. The Song Dynasty had trading vessels that were going off the China coast hundreds of miles, going down to Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and yes, indeed, into the Indian Ocean. And this was hundreds of years before Zhang He's treasure fleets. So it really wasn't that special that the Chinese could sail to the Indian Ocean. They'd been doing it for hundreds of years. It was the fact that their ships were very, very large and that this were these great government-sponsored expeditions. But no, Chinese had been trading long distance for a long time, particularly during the Song Dynasty. Now, that particular ship that I showed you there was a shipwreck that's been discovered off the South China coast, and it was filled with porcelain. They'd got huge amounts of Chinese export goods, yes, China, Chinese porcelain, and they were heading down to Southeast Asia, and well, we don't know what their final destination, but we can tell from their cargo that they had started up there near Hangzhou and Suzhou and picked up some cargo there. That's near the capital. Hangzhou, remember, was called Lin'an during the Southern Song Dynasty. They'd gone down the coast and stopped at Quanzhou. Quanzhou is also sometimes called Venice of the East, but I'll tell you, if you look at the size and scale of Quanzhou, Venice at this time was a muddy little fishing village compared to the massive commercial hub that was Quanzhou. The ship picked up some cargo in Quanzhou, then it headed down to Guangzhou, past where we would find modern-day Hong Kong, and after picking up a bit more cargo in Guangzhou, it headed out into the ocean, and we assume it hit a storm or something and sank a little bit further south of there, along with all its cargo. But this level of shipbuilding technology, as I said, is so far ahead of anyone else in the world. And it's not the Ming Dynasty, it's the Song Dynasty where we see clear evidence of this. And yes, they have the magnetic compass, so they're quite comfortable going well away from land and be able to navigate with all of that good technology as well. Now, back to the scroll and the next major scene. So many things going on. I can't possibly tell you about all of them, so let's pick a few. Well, there's a wheelwright. You can see he's clearly repairing or making a new wheel, and there's a couple of guys hard at work there. Now we have a scene here which can be interpreted in different ways. Is he a storyteller? Perhaps he's telling a story for money. He certainly has got quite a big audience. Or is he selling something very interesting? Or what exactly is going on there? Don't know. And then down here we have a sedan chair. And remember I said I think it was probably mostly females. Well, here we have a very clear female figure who looks like she's about to get in there, or I'm not quite sure what she's doing. And we have some guy here who seems to be a little bit overweight perhaps, and he's having difficulty getting on his mount. And there are a bunch of people helping him out, or they all certainly seem to be really rather interested in something or other. And then what else have we got going on here? We have up in the background these interesting fellows. Now, I actually only noticed these when I was preparing this episode. I'd never realized what they were before. But when I thought, well, I better try and work out what those Chinese characters say. And the first one, Yunqi, is like fortune or luck. The middle one is something like, tell your destiny. And the last one is something like divine divination, or miraculous fortune telling, depending on how you want to translate it. In other words, he's a fortune teller. People are going there and paying money to have their fortunes. Please tell me, yes, you will have an unhappy love affair. If you're wet, it is likely that it's raining, or that kind of thing. I mean, people don't like uncertainty, and they're willing to pay people to help them interpret what lies in their future. And what do we got here? Well, we have a little drainage ditch, or a tiny little stream or something that's running through the town. And then we have all these fellows, and they look rather lazy, don't they? We have a horse in the background, and we have a bunch of sleepy guys, and we have a bunch of weapons. We're pretty confident this is a military barracks. And it's one of the interesting things. These are the only soldiers we see anywhere in the scroll. Now, if you compare to what you'd imagine you'd see in a Western equivalent of this, you would imagine you'd see a lot of soldiers. In fact, the closest equivalent we have in the West is perhaps the Bayeux Tapestry, which is the story of the Norman conquest of England. And of course, that's almost entirely military, filled with soldiers. And, there's even a good scene with people being shot with arrows and arrows sticking out of a guy's eye and all the rest. But in the Song Dynasty, in this scroll, we see soldiers almost nowhere except in this one place. And they don't exactly look very martial or rigorous or disciplined, do they? Now, this is exactly right for the Song Dynasty, because the Song Dynasty did not respect its soldiers, and they would pay a price for it. There's a saying that's pretty well known in China, and it really seems to originate from the Song Dynasty. Good iron is not used to make nails. Good men do not become soldiers. So the problem with this, of course, is if people have this idea, well, good people are not going to join the army. You're going to be recruiting people who are considered to be bad people. I mean, it's a lose-lose situation. You want good people in the army, and you want to encourage good people to join the army. And we have a famous scholar of the Song Dynasty, Ouyang Xiu, and this is what he wrote. Since the country ended major warfare in the Jingde era, 33 years have now passed. The soldiers who had actual combat experience have all grown old and died. The new recruits have never heard the sound of gongs and drums, nor have they ever seen a battle formation. Born in times of peace and fed with ample clothing and food, they have inevitably become arrogant and lazy. Well, that seems to match what we see in the scroll. And perhaps the most famous Song Dynasty comment on this was another famous literati, Wang Anshi, who sent a memorial to the Song Emperor Renzong. And here is what he wrote. Nowadays, the most important and serious responsibilities of the realm, those that the ruler must select with the utmost care, are entrusted to treacherous, fierce, and untrustworthy men whose talent and conduct are so poor that they cannot even win the trust of their own villages and neighbourhoods. This is precisely why the court today constantly lives in fear and anxiety about the frontiers and worries that the palace guards cannot be relied upon for security. Who today is unaware that the frontier guards and palace guards cannot be depended upon to maintain peace and security? Yet because the educated gentlemen of the realm regard the carrying of weapons as a disgrace, and because none of them can ride, shoot, or has any familiarity with military formations and maneuvers, who else is there to take up this responsibility except hired recruits and common soldiers? Now, he suggested a whole bunch of military reforms. Some of them were put in place, many of them were reversed, and, well, this is during the period of the Northern Song, and I've already told you what ultimately will happen to the Northern Song. Their army will prove ineffective. They will be decisively defeated. They will lose their capital. The emperor will be taken prisoner, and they will have to flee to the south and only hold on by by their fingernails to avoid being conquered entirely. So, certainly, the Song Dynasty paid for its lack of respect for the military. But I don't want you to be misled that the Song Dynasty were bad soldiers. In fact, this is the time period where we first see anywhere in the world gunpowder weapons being used. Now, there's this idea that floats around. I've seen it all over the place, and it's complete nonsense. It goes something like this. Oh, yes, the Chinese invented gunpowder, but they were really silly. They only used it for fireworks and scaring, ghosts and stuff like that. It took the smart Europeans to actually use gunpowder to make weapons. Well, it's complete nonsense. We know that the gunpowder technology had been mastered in China at this time. We know when the Mongols attacked the Jurchen Jin dynasty in the north, we know that the Jurchens fought back using gunpowder weapons. We know when the Mongols invaded southern Song, they put up an almighty fight. I mean, the Mongols were unstoppable, really. When the Mongols put their mind to it, nobody defeated the Mongols. But the Song dynasty made them work hard for it. And they made extensive use of gunpowder weapons. They weren't quite up to cannons yet, but they found plenty of other ways to militarize this new technology. So we have a list here from a book written by Zhao Yurong, and in this particular list, he wasn't talking about all the weapons China had. He was talking about the arsenal that one Song Dynasty city had as it was preparing to defend itself from Mongol attack. And this was some of the weapons that they had: 7,000 gunpowder crossbow bolts, 10,000 gunpowder arrows, 3,000 barbed gunpowder packages, 20,000 ordinary gunpowder packages. Now, barbed gunpowder packages, we're talking bombs here. Stick a bunch of nails in it. I mean, you need somewhere to launch them. You could launch them from catapults. But honestly, if you're trying to defend city walls, these kind of bombs are actually really rather effective. The enemy are gathered at the base of the wall, and you just drop the bombs over on the ground, and bam, shrapnel everywhere. Really quite effective and useful for defending cities. We know they had these things that they called fire-spitting lances, which were basically bamboo tubes made into primitive shotguns. You light a fuse and get away, because you can know that obviously a bamboo tube is likely to shatter and send splinters everywhere, but it was basically a very, very early one-shot shotgun. And we have here a bomb-throwing catapult and all of the rest. They really put up a hard fight. And they made, well, the Mongols won, yes, but they really had to work for it. This idea that the Song were just, soft and pathetic, which honestly is actually quite a common view inside China today. They tend to look back at the great dynasties. I think the Han dynasty was amazing. The Tang dynasty was fantastic. The Song dynasty, they were kind of also rans. They never really managed to rule all of China. They got conquered by the Jurchens. They couldn't even beat the Khitans, and goodness me, then the Mongols conquered them all together. Oh, what a bunch of soft wimps. More interested in poetry and scholarship than being tough and fighting. Bah, not really worth paying attention to. But seriously, that's not an uncommon attitude in mainland China. But actually, I think the poor old Song have been, got a false reputation. They were pretty tough. But, nobody beats the Mongols. Now, what else have we got going on here? We have some interesting things there. We've got another person with this very large hat and a fan on a horse, again with a servant in the front saying, "Clear the way, clear the way." We have this really interesting contraption with an umbrella over it. I've really studied that and tried to work out what it is. It looks like a basket with some sort of array of twigs or something like this. Is it sort of for decoration? Is it nice smelling? I really don't know quite what's going on there. And then we have a bunch of things. The only place where, I'll get ahead of myself. Here we have again what's probably a woman who seems to be holding a child. Again, unusual, worth noting every time you see a figure that looks like a female. And there's what I was about to say. The only time we see any pigs anywhere in the scroll. We saw buffalo elsewhere. We see a lot of donkeys and horses. This is the only time we see any pigs. And him up there, I look at him and I wonder, is he supposed to be a Buddhist monk or something? I'm not sure. He's kind of hard to make out, so I won't speculate too far on that. Now, as we proceed along in the scroll, we have a lot of stuff going on here as well. I mean, so much stuff going on everywhere. We have this wagon. I really love the detail. You can really see how they would weave the roofs of their wagons and all of the rest. So what else have we got going on here? Now, I've seen one suggestion from some fellow online who thought that this shop was selling something like melons. I think personally that those are fans. Now, is he right? Well, he might be, I guess. Am I right? Well, obviously I think I am. But to my mind, I don't think that's round fruit. They don't seem three-dimensional to me. I think he's probably selling fans. Now, we've got this old guy riding a donkey, and it's interesting because the donkey seems to have a foal following it along after it. It's the only time we see a juvenile, but, if you've got a mother and you need to go into town, a mother donkey, and you need to go into town, and it's got a foal, well, I guess you got to take the foal along too. Then up here we have two child figures. Now, one possibility is that those guys leaning against the bridge are their parents. But I strongly suspect, based on what I've seen in China myself, that these kids are basically being sent by their parents to sell stuff. Don't they kind of look like they're bothering the adults? Oh, I've got something to sell here, buy something. Or maybe even beggars. Ah, sir, I'm poor and starving. Could you please spare a few coins? So either selling things or begging would be my guess. And I really like this scene here. You can see there's a river running along, and what do people like to do? They're just sort of resting and chatting and gossiping, and one guy seems like he might be pointing to something down the river, but, you know, people just like to do it. There's something mesmerizing about watching water flow under a bridge as you just sit there letting the time of day pass you by. Now, back to the scene again. Now, we've got something going on here. And again, I so wish we had some words or some captions to explain what was happening. Now, the center of attention seems to be this one. He's down on his knees, and there's something there. Is it a child having a tantrum, perhaps? That's one possibility. It looks like there's some legs. Or is it he was carrying something and he dropped it? Is it perhaps a pig carcass or something like this? But if you look, he's really the center of attention. These two people seem to be laughing and having a grand old time looking at it, and they think it's hilarious. Whoops, excuse me. And everybody else seems to be looking in that direction. They're all looking in the direction of whatever's going on there. But what is it? I don't know. I mean, make your best guess. You might be right. Now, we finally get into the town. And this is also demonstrating what I was talking about, the urban expansion and the population growth. Because traditionally, you don't want any houses outside the city wall. But here we have the city gate. And how many houses and taverns and shops have we seen outside the city wall? And going through the gate, leaving the city, are several camels. Now, this is one of the pieces of evidence that strongly suggests this is indeed Kaifeng, or at least a northern Song Dynasty city, because the southern Song were cut off from the Silk Road. The Jurchens and the Khitans had access to that, so having these caravans of Bactrian camels during the southern Song is unlikely. So this certainly helps date it to the northern Song when they had better access to the Silk Road. Now, these camels are two-humped Bactrian camels. There's two kinds of camel. There's the Arabian camel with the single hump that is highly adapted to the deserts of Arabia, and the Bactrian camels, domesticated roughly the same time from Central Asia. They have two humps. They're stockier and wooler, with much thicker wool, and they are, well, better adapted, not just for the desert, but for the brutal cold temperatures that you could get up in those days. Now, down at the very bottom, pardon me, can you see that guy? He's having a shave. That could easily be from modern day times. He's got his razor. Yes, there's no caption, but I think we'll all agree that's a barbershop. And then all sorts of other things going on. Who knows what everything is? Now this guy with the horse. Now you see the horse's body language is quite interesting. That helped me interpret this Chinese sign. Now the sign is pretty hard to read, so this is guesswork, but it's educated guesswork. I think what it says is miao zao, which can be translated as fresh early cut grass. In other words, fodder for the horses. Now, the characters are kind of fuzzy and hard to read, but they look pretty similar to the characters that I've suggested, and certainly the fact that there's the guy on the horse and the way the horse seems to be looking at that sign with great interest suggests that my guesswork about what that sign says might just be correct. Now, you know the saying about death and taxes? Well, we don't see any sign of any graves or death, but we definitely see signs of tax on the scroll. This, we're all pretty confident, is a government official. He's at the city gate and he's inspecting all the cargo as it arrives. And why does he do that? Because there's going to be a tax to be paid. And you can see there's a guy down here and he looks like he's got his little tablet and he's writing on it and keeping a careful record of it as he's counting through what's there. What do you owe? Well, of course, the government always has to have its cut. And you see these guys here, what are they doing? Well, they seem to be in the process of loading or unloading their cargo so that the inspectors at the gate can examine it. It's all terribly problematic and annoying for the customers, and you can bet they're going to try, the merchants, I should say, and you can bet they're going to try and sneak things in if they can. But, well, the way the scroll shows it, of course, everybody has to pay their tax. The government will always take its cut. Now, I've mentioned the technology, and it's worthwhile noting it again when we look at this government inspector, because there's so many signs of modernity. We see porcelain of a quality we've never seen before. We see textile production skyrocketing, copper production, tin production, lead production. In fact, they can actually detect the Song Dynasty in glaciers in Greenland. Because, when you get industrial pollutants and then the snow falls elsewhere and you take ice core samples, you can see clear evidence of industrial activity. And there's only one place in the world that's doing it on that kind of scale that would be detected in these Greenland ice core samples, and it is Song Dynasty China. Paper production. Well, in this time in Europe, they're writing everything on parchment, which is basically calf skin. The Chinese have invented paper a long time ago, and by now they've absolutely perfected it. And they've invented the printing press long before the Europeans got around to it. Now, people sometimes again say the stupid things like, oh, well, yes, the Chinese might have had a printing press, but the Europeans had movable typeface. Well, they had woodblock printing as early as the 860s. The oldest example is this Buddhist document that I've shown you there, the Diamond Sutra. But they had movable typeface by the 1040s. Incredibly early. It's about 4 centuries ahead of Gutenberg's Bible and all of the rest. Now, it's actually rather interesting because it both proves and disproves what a lot of people say about the importance of the printing press in Europe, for modernity in Europe and everything that happened. So it's often said as it's the key invention, and they're kind of right, because all of the things they point to in Europe that happened because of the printing press happened in China 400 years earlier. It makes books so much cheaper. As a result of that, literacy explodes, popular culture explodes. From the point of view of an ancient historian, you stop losing documents from the past. Because up until now, whether it's in the East or West, books from the ancient world only survive if somebody got round to making a handwritten copy of it. Once you get printing press, you can bang out hundreds of copies at the same time. You stop getting copyists' mistakes. You stop getting errors that creep in. And we see this in both documents from ancient Greece and ancient Rome and from ancient China. Clear evidence that mistakes were made as people hand copied them. But for people who are studying ancient China, they're lucky because there's 400 years fewer mistakes of handwritten copyists' errors. So, well, all of that stuff was the same in Asia as it was in Europe. But again, they didn't have an industrial revolution. So, well, why not? We'll get to that later. One of the other things they had associated with all this commercial activity we're seeing is paper money. First place in the world ever to have paper money. So many things we associate with modernity, we find for the first time in Song Dynasty China. Now on the left you can see there's the metal stamp, and on the right is you put it in the ink and you stamp it on the paper, and that's what you get. Now technically it's not quite paper money as we would see it, because it's not backed by the government. you might call them merchant promissory notes. In other words, a merchant house prints these out and says, if you present us with this bit of paper, we'll pay you that amount of coins. It's interesting. I lived in Hong Kong for about 4 years, and the money in Hong Kong was not actually issued by the British Hong Kong government. I was living in Hong Kong when it was still under the British. All the money in Hong Kong was actually issued by 3 different banks. The banks issued the money, and you'd have the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank money and the Standard Chartered Bank money. And then Bank of China started issuing money as well. So it actually worked exactly that way when I was living in Hong Kong. And other scenes, well, that seems pretty obvious. It's a guy who's making bows and arrows. There's a bunch of barrels. Are they associated with making bows and arrows? Those things in the background, are they probably targets for, they sell for people to practice their archery? And then we have another crowded scene, a very elaborate 3-storied restaurant, hotel, whatever you want to call it. And that sign there, Zhang Zeduan, is pretty clear what that means. It's a high-grade wine shop. Now, that thing there, I'm a bit dubious about it. I've read some things online, and there's a text that suggests that, at least in the southern Song, remember the scroll's probably from the northern Song, that if you hung something like that outside your establishment, it might suggest that the females inside might offer services more than just being waitresses. They might have other special services you could pay for. You can use your imagination what I'm talking about there. And so some people have seen these. There's one on either side of the door, and maybe it's a lantern, or maybe it's just a decoration, or maybe it's a sign that there are additional services, not just food and alcohol, that are offered for sale in these premises. Is it? Well, that I don't know. And here we have something else, that Chinese character on the right, Shang. Basically, it means good smelling. Clearly, there's a second character under it. There's no way I'm ever going to guess what that is. It's too hidden and obscured. So something sweet smelling food or something. And we have another one of those baskets where the guy seems to be selling these branches. What they are, I couldn't really tell you. And they've got a child there. In fact, at least 2 children that are being held up. One's on this man. Is he a man? I don't know. He's on the shoulders, and this woman seems to be rather awkwardly holding children. Is it 1 child or 2 children? It kind of looks like when you use AI to make art and they stick too many legs in. I have a bit of a job trying to interpret exactly what we're looking at there. But it's not AI, it's 1,000 years old. And clearly, this guy seems to be having a big grin on his face, and this guy up here in the background has a big smile on his face. So something funny is happening there, but what? What's supposed to be so funny? I wish we knew. Yeah, look at them all. And then we have another woman in a sedan chair, and is that her husband following along with his fan on the horse behind? Perhaps. And then we have this establishment up in the background. Now, there's something in red written on the sign, but I've not even tried to guess what that one says. Now, this other establishment, I think it's the Young Family Fine Wine Shop. Now, I found a couple of other people who have interpreted it rather differently, and they've translated it as the Young Family Medicine for Treating Illness, a doctor's office or a medical clinic. Now, it all comes down to that 4th character. You read from top to bottom. So we all agree on the first 3 characters. Now, I think that this last character is probably dual, because there's so many cafes and advertisements for alcohol, and that character, which is partially obscured and very poorly written, I think is dual. Other people have interpreted it to be this character here, and, well, I'm not going to say they're wrong. It's not what I think it says, but they might very well be right. So is it another shop, bar, restaurant with alcohol, or is it a doctor's clinic? I don't know. It could be either one. And then what else have we got going on in this scene? We have here Well, first off, the sign over on the right. That's pretty clear. Sun is a Chinese family name, so it's the Sun family shop. And the second character, Yang, means sheep. So it's Sun's sheep shop, literally, but they're not selling sheep. They're selling, barbecued meats. In fact, you can see down here on the bottom right that that's exactly what they're doing. They've looks like a charcoal burner or something, and they're busy cooking up the lamb or the mutton or whatever else it is. Now, this scene here is very, very interesting. We have a whole bunch of people who seem to be surrounding and listening intently to this one guy with a very full beard. Now, who or what is he? We don't know. Is he a storyteller? Is he a wise man? Is he whatever he is? People are paying a lot of attention to him. Now, I have a suspicion, and I think this every time I see a character who's clearly unique. They're not like other pictures, that we're missing something. Now, I don't know what we're missing, but I suspect that the artist expected his own audience in the Song Dynasty to recognize them and understand who they were. It would be like, let's say we had a modern one with a modern equivalent of this, and we inserted a few characters in it. Like there's a guy who looks kind of like Abraham Lincoln. And we go, oh, we know who that is. There's somebody who's dressed up like Mickey Mouse. Oh, we know who that is. We'd pick up the reference because we have all of the cultural background to know what that guy represents. I suspect that we're missing a whole bunch of stuff. There are things that the artist expected his audience to notice, but we just don't quite get it. So who is he? I suspect it's something like this. Like if we had a scroll and we stuck a guy in like that, well, I mean, I'm sure there never in history was a Robin Hood or anybody who really dressed like that outside of Errol Flynn in Hollywood. But if you put a guy like that in a scroll or a mural or something like this, you're not going to have to tell a modern audience, well, that's Robin Hood. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. If he's surrounded by people, well, he's probably saying, well, let's go and rob from the rich and give to the poor or whatever else, because we have the cultural background to understand what the picture represents. But I think we're missing things that are in the scroll. Well, that's my theory anyway. So here is a quote. A picture may tell 1,000 words, but without words or context, it speaks in 1,000 different tongues. Yes, that's a quote by me. I just said it. Yeah, I invented it for this episode. I was looking for a good quote that would have a nice message along like it, and I couldn't find one, so I made it up. But it's a quote now because I said it. There you go. A quote by Jonathan Markley. Okay, back to this fantastically crowded market square inside the city. So we have all sorts of things going on. Up in the background, we have a wheelbarrow, more like we would imagine a normal wheelbarrow. And then we have a sign here. Now, I'm pretty confident that says Brocade Bolts and Fine Silk Shop. The characters are not written very well, and I've given you my interpretation of the characters, but in it, because it's also in the distance, I haven't even really tried to read the stuff that's going along horizontal, but at least the vertical sign, and there's another character higher up, but at least that's my interpretation. It's selling fine silks. And in fact, that picture on the top right is actually a Song Dynasty empress. And in China Daily, they had a story about an exhibition in China where they had recreated clothes from ancient Chinese paintings. And so there's an example of Song Dynasty fine silk. Now this one, there's a whole bunch of writing that runs along there, but it was beyond my ability to decipher and work out exactly what it said. It's just written too unclearly. But the vertical sign, on the other hand, it's the Liu family premium agarwood and sandalwood incense. Now, you think you haven't heard of agarwood, but in fact you have. Sandalwood. Actually, years and years ago when I was a kid, my family visited India, and one of my older brothers bought a chess set, and some of the chess set was made of sandalwood, and I'll tell you, it smells wonderful. It's really got a very interesting smell, and agarwood is another one of these things. Now, it's made from the aquilaria tree, which is it grows mostly in Southeast Asia. You'd find it in Malaysia, Vietnam, maybe it'll cross into Bangladesh, those kind of areas. But it's also called the line aloe. Now, the reason why you think you've never heard of it, but you probably have, is because under the name of line aloe, it appears in something that most people, at least in the West, are very familiar with, the Gospel of John, chapter 19, after the crucifixion of Jesus. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, who brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Now those aloes, line aloes, scholars and historians are confident that those aloes are agarwood. It's expensive, sweet-smelling wood that it has been imported from the East. It would have cost a lot. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with spices and strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. And while I was looking for images of agarwood, I found on Temu, on this image on the right, where they are selling agarwood and sandalwood incense sticks, which they say is useful for worship and other purposes. I guess people meditate to it or use it in sort of Buddhist religious ceremonies or something. I'm not really sure what they use it for, but on the left is agarwood and on the right is sandalwood. Now, we have a few other interesting guys right in the middle of the street. We have on the left the bald guy who's pretty clearly a Buddhist monk. And is he trying to spread his faith and get a convert? He seems to be in deep conversation with the guy next to him. And then we have these other two guys on the right who are probably Taoist monks or Taoist priests or something along the lines. Now, first off, you notice I put Tao, not Tao, and I've crossed out Tao. This is one of the common mistakes that bugs the heck out of me. It's just, you can't get rid of it. The correct spelling is not T-A-O. That's based on an outmoded and not very accurate conversion of the Chinese character. You shouldn't call it the Tao. You should call it the Tao, and Taoism with a D. And in fact, the Taoists and the Buddhists were major rivals. To my mind, at least as an outsider, their faiths look quite similar, but they were really rather bitter rivals and considered themselves enemies. I guess they were competing for the same turf and the same followers. Now, we have a bunch of other things going on. See, these guys seem to be having a good time laughing or talking with each other. And the sign on the left, I'm a bit unsure about this translation, but this is what I've got here. Greedy Wang's long stay accommodation. Well, I'm confident it is long stay accommodation. But the Greedy Wang, is it a catchy nickname for the guy? It could be something along those lines. I'll leave it at that. And then this one on the right, well, the top two characters I'm confident is Li Jia, which is the Li family. It's a pretty common thing to have the name of the family who's running the business on the sign, but I couldn't decipher the characters below it, so I just left it at that. It's the Li family business who are selling something, who knows what. I could not decipher these characters down here. And then in the background we have a stall selling things. And I'll tell you, this reminded me so much of an experience I had in Beijing. In Beijing, there's this magnificent open-air market where they sell amazing amounts of all sorts of goods. And the guidebook warned me before we went that there were pickpockets all over the place. And yeah, there absolutely are pickpockets all over the place. So if you go to Beijing, go to the open-air market, but secure your valuables. Now this shop here, it's got signs all over the place. And fortunately, we're able to read most of them. So what have we got? We've got the house of Dr. Zhao. In fact, Tai Chung, Zhao Tai Chung, look, that's a official position normally. It'd be like a government doctor or a. So was he formerly a government doctor, or is he just claiming an elevated title, or does he actually represent? Is he like a public doctor's office? Well, I don't know, but Tai Chung, his title, Dr. Zhao, is certainly quite a respectable medical title. What else have we got? We've got top to bottom there. The imperial physician dispenses pills to treat stomach and intestinal illnesses. Probably. And then we've got this other one. Well, considering how many different shops we saw selling booze and how many people seem to be partaking of the booze, it's not so surprising, therefore, that he should be offering hangover cures and other things for alcohol-induced injuries. And then we have another one. This one about the 5 overexertions and the 7 injuries. Formula for deficiency and weakness. So these ideas that there are all these different conditions caused by these different problems, and well, anyway, we won't go into the details. And you see here, he seems to be treating a child. He's some pediatrics going on there. And while I was researching this particular shop, I found this image online of, well, it's not Lego, it's a different brand, but similar idea, and it's actually Dr. Zhao's medical office from the Qing Ming Festival scroll. $113 seems rather expensive, mind you. And then we have a few other things going on. We've got over here these guys. There's a man with a little child. We have this sign here, which is almost certainly a pawn shop. But I'm not sure if the guys in the background are involved in the pawn shop or that's something else. And then this fellow here. Remember my Robin Hood analogy? I think, well, he's very clearly unique. There's nobody else on the scroll who looks anything like him. And when I see him, I can't help but think of this fellow. There's only one person that I've ever seen in Chinese history who ever has a backpack thing like that with all those lucky charms that are hanging down all the rest. Well, one guy online thought he was a peddler selling stuff. But I wonder if he's actually this guy on the right. And that's not a peddler. He's also not from the Song Dynasty. He's from a much earlier period in Chinese history. But remember I said this was a time period of an explosion of popular literature and all the rest? Well, this guy on the right is Xuanzang. Now, who is Xuanzang? Well, he was a Buddhist monk, and he traveled to India to gather up a whole bunch of Buddhist scrolls and bring them back so they could be translated in Chinese so that the Buddhism in China could be properly interpreted and understood. It was really a really important journey in the history of East Asian Buddhism. And this backpack, can you see all the scrolls? So these are all the scrolls of all of these sacred manuscripts that he brought back from India. And it's the only person I've ever seen in Chinese art wearing a backpack even vaguely resembling that. Now, Xuanzang really was an absolutely epic journey in the 600s. Chang'an was the Chinese capital at the time, and he traveled way up the Silk Road, around some brutal deserts, down into India, spent a whole pile of time in India visiting various different monasteries and sacred archives and things like this, gathering up all sorts of scrolls before in due course he traveled back north and returned to China. It was an absolutely epic journey. And well, and by the way, I'll pronounce his name one more time because people always in the West always have a lot of problem when you see an X. When you see an X, always treat it like an SH. Xuanzang. Xuanzang. The travels of the monk Xuanzang and his epic journey to the West. Now, it was such an epic journey that in fact it got turned into an epic story where the whole thing was mythologized. We often call it the Journey to the West. Sometimes people know it under another name, the Monkey King. It's been made into TV shows. When I was a little kid in New Zealand, there was a dubbed TV show we used to watch from China, which was we called the Monkey King. There's stories, there's movies, there's books, and there are 4 classics of Chinese literature, and Journey to the West is one of them. And in that, there are these 3 supernatural characters. There's the pig, there's the kind of guy, but like an ogre, and there's the Monkey King, who was like a demoted god or something like that. And what they've got to do is they've got to protect the monk. And the monk's name is Xuanzang. And in fact, in this story, because they're Buddhists, the bad guys who they sometimes have to fight and get around are actually Taoists. Remember I said the Buddhists and the Taoists were rivals or opponents of each other? So I suspect that it's something like this. You see down the bottom, you've got a guy who seems to be telling a story, and he's got a whole bunch of people who seem to be really interested in listening to him. And if you go straight up from him, what do you hit? You hit this interesting guy with the backpack. So I suspect it's something like this. The artist is telling us what the story is. The guy at the bottom is telling a story and everybody's listening to it. What story is he telling? He's telling the story of the monk Xuanzang and his journey to the West. Well, this is entirely my theory, but I like it, and I strongly suspect there might be something to it. Okay, moving along. Now we have this fellow riding the horse with the big hat. Another fairly unique looking guy. He's got some servants carrying stuff along with him. And it has been suggested, this is not my idea, that what we're seeing here is something like Hitchcock putting himself in his own movies, or Peter Jackson did the same thing there. He's a drunken townsman. Before the hobbits make it to the prancing pony, he briefly appears and belches. So others have suggested that this fellow on the horse might actually be the artist inserting himself into his own picture. Well, it's a nice theory anyway. Is it Zhang Zeduan? Well, could be. Now, one of the other things we have going on here is the problem that the scroll just stops. This is the end. We've got the doctor's office, we've got the guy who might be Zhang Zeduan, we've got the guy there who might be the monk Xuanzang, and it reaches here, and there seems to be some sort of like bridge-like thing, and then it just stops. It even, there's even a tree cut in half. Now, one possibility is the scroll used to be twice as long. It's not supposed to stop here. Down through the ages, it got broken in half. Maybe it was a two-part. Maybe when it got looted, only one half was saved. Maybe just, these things happen in history. Things get lost. And the reason for that is we have to strongly suspect there should have been a lot more of it. We have later versions of the scroll. So during the Qing Dynasty, the final dynasty of China, we have another version of the Qing Ming Festival. And it's very, very similar. You've got the bridge scene. You've got, there's the city gate scene, all the rest. But as you keep going off to the left, well, there's a close-up of the bridge scene, The bridge is stone, not wood, but we've got very similar scenes. The boat being pulled upriver, there's a heck of a lot more people working on the rope in this case. We've got covered shops over the bridge and all the rest, but very, very clearly inspired by the earlier Song Dynasty version. There's the gate going through it, the river in the background, the guys going through the city gate. Again, a lot more elaborate, but again, following a very similar thematic pattern. But when we get to the far left, we have lakes, we have an imperial park, we have a Clare palace. So it may be one of the great tragedies that we actually only have half of the Song Dynasty scroll. Now, it really is very famous. In Shanghai, they had a World Expo in 2010. Every country comes and has a pavilion to represent their best wear. And the Chinese chose to make their whole pavilion all about this scroll. They animated it. They had the horses moving along. They even had, so at nighttime, the lanterns would come on, the lamps would come on, the river would ripple, and all of these kind of things. And well, I would probably get a copyright ding if I tried to show you some of the videos, but if you go on YouTube and you just search for it, you'll find it. However, I want to point out something here. Look at the title. This is not my title. This is from Xinhua.net, a Chinese news agency. They've translated the name of the scroll in English into Riverside Scene at the Qing Ming Festival. In other words, they've assumed that the Qing Ming refers to the Qing Ming Jie, the Qing Ming Festival, the grave sweeping festival. I don't think that's right. And it's a translation that is possible, but it's a translation that many scholars have pointed out is not certain by any means. And there's a whole TV show. When I was looking around on YouTube, I found actually a whole TV show where they took scenes from the scroll and then dramatized it into there was a whole murder mystery thing where an evil, corrupt government official was picking on a couple, and the woman murdered him, and then they had to hide the body as people were investigating. Oh, they made a whole drama out of it. And this is a series of photos where a guy was sort of inspired by the Qing Ming Shang but instead made it all sort of very modern, and ideas of, there's police brutality down the bottom and all sorts of things. And this one hangs in my home just above the piano. It's quite large. We bought this in China. It was a large cross stitch, which I then asked my mother to make, and it took her months to make it. And that's not the Song Dynasty Qing Ming Shang Tu. That's the Qing Dynasty one with the stone bridge that I showed you, but it is quite magnificent. Unfortunately, because of the way it hangs in my home, it was very hard to get a good photo of it because the lights reflect off the glass and things like this, but that's an exhibit in my home. Now, just got to wrap it up. This has been going a long time. It's 2 hours already, so just got to wrap up this thing and talk about the Naito hypothesis, because I've been keep mentioning as we go through the scroll this idea of modernity in China. So this Japanese scholar suggested that Song Dynasty China is where the modern world begins, the end of the Chinese Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern world. And it's the first country, the first civilization to begin modernity. Now, there's some interesting things about the Song Dynasty. It's a very southern dynasty. Of all the big main dynasties, there's Han, Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing. There's 5 big ones, with the Chinese always ranking the Song at the bottom of that list. But all the others were much more northern. Now, in China, there's a big cultural divide between northern Chinese and southern Chinese. I won't go into all the details of it, but just take my word for it. So some of the aspects of what we think of the Song Dynasty, especially in the second half, the southern Song, it's much more culturally southern. It was cut off from access to the Silk Road. Now, we suspect that caused something which was very similar to what happened in Europe. When the rise of Islamic power in the Middle East cut the Europeans off from access to the Silk Roads, what did the Europeans do? They turned to the sea. And this ultimately led to, the Age of Discovery, and Columbus and Henry the Navigator and all of that other good stuff for European history. And the Song Dynasty, having been cut off from the trade routes down the Silk Road, seemed to have done the same thing. It was much more focused on maritime trade than any other Chinese dynasty. In fact, it seems quite un-Chinese. Except for one Ming dynasty emperor who funded those huge treasure fleets. The Song Dynasty seems to have been by far the most focused on overseas trade, using boats across the sea. And it was also by far the most commercial of any of the dynasties. Most traditional pre-modern dynasties, not just in China but elsewhere as well, get most of their income from grain, taxing the farmers. Seems like the Song Dynasty got a much bigger percentage of its income from commercial activity. And even today in China, southern China, from Shanghai southwards, is considered to be much more commercial. The northern is, in Beijing especially, considered to be all about politics, and there's a whole bunch of cliches. The northern is just simple and straightforward. The southern is very commercial and money focused, and there's a whole bunch of things. I won't get into it. And certainly they lost a huge portion. The Great Plain, that was the bread bowl of modern and ancient China. So was that why they were forced to turn to the sea and commercialism? It's also when foot binding began. Now, is this to do with Southern Chinese? Is this to do with commercialism? Is this to do with something else? It's certainly a whole bunch of strange things about them, considering it very dainty, but it was really a dreadful practice. You actually had to break the bones and bind them up and then re-break them to stop the feet growing any bigger. And it's also been seen as a sort of a style of conspicuous consumption. If you were rich enough to cripple your own females in your own family, well, then you didn't need them to be productive and working. So look how rich I am. That's probably also why you see a lot of these high status females being carried in these sedan chairs, because they probably weren't capable of walking on their own. Really quite an awful custom. Now, of course, could China have had a full-blown industrial revolution? I've hinted at it already, saying they seem to be well on the road. So the big question is, why not? Well, just like every other big question, there's multiple answers. So people have blamed the government. It was central government authority that monopolized all power and didn't give access to innovation. People have blamed the merchants because, well, when you look at the rise of the West and Europe and all the rest, well, Venice and Genoa and Florence and, that led the Renaissance, not to mention the Hanseatic League in the Baltic Sea, that it seemed to be the merchants who pioneered a lot of really amazing stuff in European history and the rise of modernity. So some people have blamed the merchants. Some people have blamed the foreigners. Well, the Mongols did conquer them, and the Jurchens did conquer half of them a bit earlier on, so that certainly wouldn't help the Song Dynasty go on to an industrial revolution. Others blame the scholars. They look at the early Song Dynasty where scholars were writing books like, how to mine coal and avoid having your miners die from the poison gases and all the rest. And, they talk increasing introspection, starting to get into more, metaphysical, philosophical questions and away from practical and engineering solutions. So maybe it was the damn university professors. Well, blame me. Or maybe it was the younger generation's fault. Here's a quote from a Chinese book. Feudal obscurantism not only killed the hope of carrying forward the Song and Yuan creative spirit, it almost entirely obliterated the trail blazed by the masters. So we had the giants in the old days who were amazingly creative, but the latter generations just let the side down and failed to carry on. Otherwise, it should have been China that rose up. Well, all of these are possibilities, and there are other good guys. There's the book called The Great Divergence by Ken Pomerantz, where he goes into a whole bunch of interesting possibilities about why you didn't get an industrial revolution in China. But for me, I tend to side... I missed one. Blame the winners. That because China tended to have great single dynasties, it stifled competition when if you had a multipolar world like you had in Europe with the French and the Spanish and the Italians and the English and Swedes and everybody competing with each other, it drove competition and drove innovation. Well, that's a possibility. But if you ask me, I'm going to go with conquest because let's face it, getting conquered by the Mongols is sure not going to help you do anything much. And in fact, imagine what would have happened in Europe if they were sort of on the cusp of an industrial revolution just before it, just needed another 50 years, 100 years, say 1700s or something like this, and a massive, unstoppable Mongol army swept through Europe and obliterated it and destroyed whole cities and all the rest. Well, that sure wouldn't help, would it? And actually, Europe escaped that in the 1200s by the skin of their teeth. The Mongols had obliterated two major European armies in Eastern Europe. Basically, Europe was wide open to them and ready to be conquered. And then all the Mongol armies just turned around and left. And the Europeans were looking at each other going, what just happened? Why aren't we dead? Where'd they go? The answer was their great Khan. In this case, Genghis Khan was long dead by this stage. The Khan Ogedei had just died. Word arrived to the Mongols that he was dead, And the way the Mongol political system worked was if you wanted to have a say in who got appointed to be the next great Khan, you had to be there. So all the Mongol armies turned around and headed back to the east so they could participate in electing the new Khan. And Europe was saved, frankly, by a miracle. Now, that's all I've got for you. Goodness me, it's been 2 hours and 10 minutes to get here. And I actually had to go with the AI, and I said to the AI, make me an American equivalent of the Qing Ming Shang tu and set it in New York. And this is what it came up with. Well, I don't know if it did a very good job or not, but it was a nice enough one to end this episode with. Goodness me, 2 hours and 10 minutes. I thought it would only take about 90 minutes, but I hope you enjoyed me talking about the Qing Ming Shang tu. Thank you and goodbye.